Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Change on the Run podcast, where we discuss common change challenges and ways to address them when you're short of time. And I'm your host, Phil Buckley. Today's topic is making decisions. Most transformation post-mortems uncover decisions that led to success or failure. Facts, options, assessment criteria, available time, and risk all play roles in the decisions made. During a large change initiative, decisions are often made quickly in response to new conditions or information. They require focus, process, and at times management intuition to make the best call and align leaders and their teams on how to activate them. So, how do you make decisions during transformations that direct and move an organization to new ways of working to adopt change? And my guest today is Stephanie Wilkes. Stephanie, welcome to the show.
Hi, Phil. Thanks so much for having me.
Stephanie, it's so great to see you again. And thanks so much for taking the time. Stephanie is a seasoned C-suite leader with over 25 years of global and senior management experience. She is a board member, a breakthrough consultant, executive coach, and team coach. Stephanie holds a Bachelor of Engineering Science, Mechanical Engineering at Western University, and a Columbia Coaching Certificate at Columbia University. So Stephanie, I know you've made all sorts of decisions at very senior levels. What's been your experience with making decisions during large changes?
Phil, thanks for asking. I think first of all, I just love the topic of your podcast. And what I really notice in my previous work and in this work I do now is there's a shift happening from a change being a unique experience, something we go from to really, it's omnipresent. And so as we think about change and decision-making in times of change, what I've really noticed is the most critical thing is not actually the choice you make. It's the process you go through to make the choice. So what's the capability you're bringing to that? What's the wise judgment? Who are you listening to? How are you building your ability to tolerate uncertainty and make choices when honestly there is no clarity of the best one? And then the other thing I will say that I think is really critical in times of change is I think and I know I've told myself that these are big decisions and they're one-way doors. Once we go through, there's no coming back. It's like everything is different. And I honestly believe in life, the only one-way door we ever walk through is choosing to have kids. Every other decision we make is changeable. And so for me, in my learning and my experience, taking the pressure off and realizing that I'll make a choice today based on my best judgment and the input and context I'm operating in. And if I learn something that helps me understand a different or maybe better choice, I can make that change. And I have sort of that noticing of my own confidence to navigate through adjustment. So it's not just the decisions that matter in these times, but it's that ability to be able to go, I decided this. 3 new things have happened. Great example right now is many companies are making pricing decisions. That's not necessarily a big transformational change, but boy, that's a big deal. And then we're finding out weeks or months later that inflation has fundamentally changed input costs and we need to make a different decision. And so it's that ability to almost rest in your own confidence that you can face whatever comes at you. That's really hard to develop and scary, regardless of how many times you've done it. But I think the most powerful skill.
Wow, there's so much that you said to unpack, and the focus on confidence, I see it through 2 different lenses. One is the decision maker, which is so true, how important it is to have the confidence, not only to make the best call at the time that with the available information, but also the confidence to realize when it's not their best decision and to flip it. But I think there's an organizational confidence there too. Just like the large changes that we've gone through, they're pressure cookers where every decision seems to be a life or death one and it has all eyes on it. And any thoughts about that role that confidence plays?
I absolutely agree with your point of view that it's essential and often we don't pay attention to it. So a couple thoughts there. So first of all, if we start about large transformations, they often start with a sense, if you like, of what we're trying to achieve, right? A new way of working or a different cost structure or speed to market, or, we've all heard that kind of 30,000 foot level. Absolutely right. And where the work needs to happen is to clarify that in a way that it provides the level of clarity that people at the more operational level need. So one of my points of view on what enables confidence is first starting with getting sufficient clarity on why we're doing it and specifically what we're hoping to achieve by that. One of the questions I often ask clients or now ask myself is, once you make this decision, how will you know it's successful? What are you looking for? What are the indicators? And what I find is in not just saying it's black or white, or I'm going this way or that way, but also acknowledging when I choose, here's what I imagine will happen, takes the pressure off that sort of point of inflection and lets me be more confident, because when I know what I think I'm going to get and I get it or I don't, it's almost like I'm building muscle memory around my own judgment and the judgment of my team. As you mentioned in the intro, I'm an engineer by training. So often I try to go back to scientific method. One of the real powerful things about the scientific method is you never do an experiment without a hypothesis. So for me, this idea in change decision-making is, what's my hypothesis? Not just how will I measure the change, but what do I think the benchmarks or the outcome will be? And if it's not that, how do I take those learnings and almost make myself smarter? The other big thing about confidence is, and I used to tell myself this all the time when I was working on the gum turnaround for Mondelez in the US, was there was no one more equipped than me to make these decisions. I knew I didn't know the right answer, right? So you have to start by acknowledging there isn't a right answer. And it's not like someone else around you, whether it's your CEO or your customer or whoever, knows the right answer. And so it's sort of staring yourself in the mirror going, no one's better able to do this than me. It's a little bit of like positive psychology or positive self-talk to say, okay, if no one else is better able to do this, I can be confident that my judgment is as good as anyone else's. And for me, that's a big part of the confidence building.
Could you share to the listeners an example of a good decision? And again, it's with hindsight, and then perhaps one that, knowing what we know now, it wasn't the best. And what's the impact on that, please?
Yeah. And I mean, I have more of the it wasn't the best than I have the good ones, but I'm happy to share stories of both. I just moved in to be president of global gum and candy for Mondelez International. And I moved into that role at a time that organizationally we were shifting more accountability to the global teams. So just some context of the change. A lot of the players on the team I was then going to lead, I had been a peer of. So I also had that change I was navigating. And it was a pretty ineffective group of people in how we were working together in terms of really capitalizing on the power of our shared expertise. So we had opportunity to work together more effectively. The decision I made was I was going to prioritize team effectiveness over everything else. So in the context of starting that change, the decision I made is I was going to invest heavily in getting us a team coach, in spending about between a third and a quarter of all of our face-to-face time just working on team performance, interactions, connections, communication, how we make decisions. At the time, my boss said, absolutely don't do this. It's a bad decision. You need to wait. You need to get some of these other things in place. Many members of the team indulged me, if I would say so boldly, to go like, oh, this is important to Steph, but like, we'll do a bit of this and then we'll move on and actually do the stuff that matters. And it was one of the clearest decisions I remember making in that role. And the impact was as follows. It really shifted that sense of how the implication of investing in our team dynamics was helping us navigate this massive transformation that was happening organizationally. Business results turned around, Phil. For the first time, we grew the category, we grew share. And that's an example of a single decision that had multiple implications that I look back on as probably one of the ones I'm most proud of in my career. Contrary, what are things I got wrong? Well, the list is longer. I had spent 4 years in Europe working on coffee, and then I was moving to the United States to lead the North American gum, candy, and chocolate business. So it was quite close into the time that Cadbury had been acquired by Kraft Foods at the time. For our listeners, we can just imagine there's a lot going on here, right? We have a newly acquired company, a new leader coming in. And so here's some decisions I made that were terrible. Okay, so one decision I made was we should use the same strategies in terms of the commercial marketplace that drive other categories like biscuits and coffee to try to drive gum. Well, it turns out the gum category behaves entirely differently than the other category. And I had missed this input and wisdom that was sitting there available to me and my team. And it was very much driven by this assumption in a time of those multiple changes I talked about. I thought what was most important was taking action and driving impact. And so this whole idea of change on the run, we don't have a lot of time. I went to, we don't have a lot of time, so let's do stuff. And the truth is, I did the wrong stuff and I did it with gusto. And so the doing it with gusto, what ends up happening is you don't really get performance. You disenfranchise the people who actually know what's going on. So I had a secondary implication of, I need to go rebuild trust with these people. And my learning was balancing that desire to prove myself or take action with the patience to listen and really respect and leverage and almost amplify the experts who were already on my business.
So given those situations, how do you build a process in that has those checks and balances so that you can avoid the fight, flight, or freeze, or the concern of, am I able to do this because it's so uncertain? I don't have anything to hold on to or a playbook. Any thoughts on how to approach that now?
Yeah, I'll start by saying, I know no one recipe or one playbook that works universally. I will share a few thoughts and principles. One is getting comfortable, like in your very kind of essence of your being, that there isn't a right answer is essential to unlock your willingness to explore options. So there's a real barrier we put up when we're searching for the right answer. We become very black and white. We become, to your point, flight, fright, or freeze, because in the absence of knowing that, I'm paralyzed to do anything, right? If there's a right answer and I don't know it, I'm pretty stuck, like almost repeating to yourself, there is no right answer here. So what are the possibilities and how do I evaluate them? I would also say that it's noticing that even if there isn't a right answer, there are really powerful ways to drive the quality of your thinking. So one of the things for me is part of driving the quality of my thinking, and what I work a lot with teams and clients on now, is how do we enable the right conversations? How do we surface assumptions versus fact? A big thing that happens in decision making is we advocate, right? So I will sit in a meeting for 5 to 10 minutes. I'll tell you 10 reasons why my point of view is right based on no fact, and not even really noticing that others are even agreeing with me. So it's that piece of what are facts, what are opinions, and of the opinions, how do we listen to those opinions in a way that actually helps us create a sense of synergy and building to a decision versus a combative, Phil says this, Stephanie says this, we just end up like in our corners. That's the second big thing. And then the trick is choosing. It's being transparent if you're the leader of a team on saying, this is what we're doing. I get that you four disagree. We're going to do this. We're going to learn from it. The other thing, during large transitions, I think there's two things a leader really has to do. One is be clear and make the decision. The other is not allow themselves to almost try to make people feel better by downplaying the implication of the choice. We have to move forward. The 4 people on this side of the table, I understand it wasn't your desired outcome. I respect your opinion and we're going to move. It's that piece of not allowing ambiguity to stay, because what happens when as leaders we allow ambiguity or lack of clarity to stay on important decisions, things filter down to the more junior folks in our organizations. And then we expect the more junior folks to address the conflicts or the choices we couldn't. And then what happens is 2 things. They get paralyzed because they don't know what to do. If anyone has ever been through a change, there is always a question of, I don't know my role. I don't know the decision rights. I don't know who makes the decision. It takes 4 times longer. And so we need to own the conflict at the more senior levels. Doesn't mean we're going to get it right, but we need to say let's choose a favorite one. For advertising budgets, this person owns the decision. You may not like it, but you now know what the clarity is. And if that turns out it's not working or it's not delivering, we're going to adjust and change. Versus saying, oh, we're going to jointly own advertising budgets and brand manager in New Zealand, can you please work it out? Which is what happens a lot.
No, certainly. As you were speaking, I recalled so many examples. Hey, it's not that big a deal. We've seen that so many times. And part of it might be, hey, we just want a decision and to move it through and we'll worry about it later. And as we know, the worry is downstream with people trying to make it work. Who makes the final call? I would say is the biggest question I've ever seen a team either dodge or make, and usually dodge because somebody is not going to like the fact that no longer will they be able to make the call. How do you build that capability and then the muscle memory when you do it, when most of the indicators are encouraging you not to do it as a leader?
I think it's a really hard and important topic. There's a few things. In the work I do with teams now in team coaching, one of the models we have at Bridge Partnership is this idea of the leadership agenda and the 3 C's. What we say is the leadership team's job is to drive a quality of thinking that enables a quality of direction that is clear, compelling, and credible, such that your team has clarity, confidence, and commitment. And so by setting teams up to say, that's what you're here for, it kind of throws the gauntlet down in a way that you can then say, wait a minute, you're avoiding creating clarity on decision rights. The implication of that is XYZ. Is that the choice you want to make? It's almost like as a leadership team, contracting on what your responsibilities are, I think is essential. I also think it's creating that fundamental psychological safety so you can have disagreement in a leadership team. Because often I think what gets us in the dodging of decision rights is we don't know how to disagree or have what we call, actually it's Adam Grant's term, task conflict. Great leadership teams are excellent at task conflict. They can disagree about topics. They're also really excellent at minimizing relationship conflicts. Because what often will happen is when you and I disagree, I make it about I don't like Phil versus Phil has a different opinion on this topic. One is super effective, the other is not. And so the other thing we work with teams on, and I work with teams on a lot, is let's be clear what you're here to do. Let's invest in psychological safety so you're prepared to disagree with each other. And then let's get really clear when we make a decision that we have follow through. Because the other thing I see a lot in big change initiatives is hands from the grave, right? It's like, we said the global team would have responsibility for brand media production budgets. And then someone in choose your favorite country says, oh, I spent this money and because I didn't know or I didn't agree with it. And there's no consequence for that action. So it's clear on responsibility, create psychological safety, follow through, hold people accountable for the new structure.
I'd love your perspective on, you do have what you believe to be the best answer. All evidence suggests this is the right way, but there's many different opinions around the table. And you know that if you don't align everyone, even if you get it through, it's your call to make, implementation will suffer and it will still be a disaster. You won't get the outcomes you're looking for. How have you, in your experience, align other people on a path forward that isn't in their best interest, but is in the interest of the organization? How do you do that? Because I've seen you do that, but I'd love you to share, how do you make it happen?
First of all, thank you for saying you've seen me do it.
I have. It's been
builds
great.
my confidence. So I appreciate you acknowledging that. I think there's a few things. It's one, trusting that everyone has positive intent is really important because it helps you respect and stay curious when people disagree. When we start to go, well, so-and-so's got a hidden agenda, or, they're never going to agree to this because it affects their job, it causes us to hear their input in a really negative filtered way. Because now I no longer feel like it's valid to getting to the best decision for the enterprise or the group. I feel like it's there to really protect or support an independent agenda. The second thing I think that's really important is having agreement before you even start the conversation around what is the problem we're trying to solve or the opportunity. Like, what is actually the decision we're trying to make? Because I've seen a ton of experience in my own time leading teams, as well as helping to now coach teams, that the reason they disagree on outcome is they're solving different problems. And so, of course, you're going to have different preferred options, right? Because if you're trying to figure out what's for dinner and I want our overall meal plan for the day, there are different outcomes to that situation. And that often happens. And so spending time at the onset of saying, what is really the decision we're trying to make or the problem we're trying to solve, I think gets skipped over a ton of times with teams. They get so into what do we decide versus what are we trying to solve for? It really leads to not disagreement, but actually confusion. The second thing is listening with curiosity. And I really struggle with this personally, is how do you listen in a way that you're actually able to hold your own opinion very, very lightly, I think is essential for creating a sense of commitment to where we're going, right? So when I come at a conversation and I'm so stuck in what I think the right outcome is, many people will not feel heard. And we know that in order to change our point of view, we first have to feel heard. It's all about the prep and the mindset and the behaviors. And then as you go through it, you start to get to, okay, so what feels like the right outcome? On the Global Gum and Candy team, we had a job aid. We had red and green cards. We didn't have yellow. Important decisions, Phil, we literally would say, hold up your card. And these are regional presidents, global presidents, functional leaders. These are very senior people. And we used a very kindergarten-like job aid. A green card was, I'm aligned, I'm committed. And then the red was, okay, we're not there yet. We need to spend more time on it. And then we would. And so it was really also, I think those job aids and skills enabled people to know they would have the space to work through what felt right as they move through the decision.
There's a couple of times that you said the consequences of behavior that's not aligned with the contracting or even just good leadership. Could you share more about that? I see it quite a bit too, that on the paper, we're going to move forward. Everyone seems to be agreed, and then everyone leaves the room or the virtual conference, and that's not the case. And any thoughts on that and any strategies to manage it? What we agree to isn't necessarily what we action on is a huge derailer.
Yeah, I think it shows up in two really common ways in organizations. It's the pre-meeting, so that before we actually have the meeting, we're all aligned and we know what people are going to say. And then the kiss of death is when we say, let's take it outside the room, right, which really means let's go have a conversation because I'm not comfortable disagreeing or sharing my opinion in this room. And then there's I have no fear of consequence if I just go do whatever I want, so I'll do it anyway. So I'm sure for your listeners, they've all experienced probably all of those. I think the most detrimental is I'm just going to go do what I want, because I think there's really two implications of that behavior. One is you never actually learn if the decision was of high quality and had the intended impact, right? Part of decision making, again, as I go back to, they're not one-way doors. I really see them as choices to get smarter and continue to evolve and move forward, right? I think for your listeners, if there's one thing they remember, it's like a decision is not a one-time event. A decision is simply a choice we make to start to behave or operate in a new or different way and figure out if it's positive or negative. Once we learn that, we go and do it again, right? So this continuous loop versus one-time loop, super important. And the real negative impact when people ignore decisions is you never get the learning, right? So you're almost like you're standing still because you never actually know whether you made a good choice. I think it's really hard, especially in consensus-driven cultures and in companies, to hold people accountable when they do that, because it can be perceived as personal versus behavioral. And I think in times of change, people are super threatened. And so they're almost on guard to find people attacking them. And so there's a couple things I would say that I've tried and I'm still learning. One is managing our own state is really important. So noticing when, let's say there's a situation that's come up when, we said we were canceling a project and someone has continued to run it, or we said we're not spending money on something and someone went ahead and did it anyways. Noticing that when you discover that as a leader or a team member, it'll likely have an impact on your mental and emotional state, and consciously choosing not to act when you're in that triggered state, when you're in that less than resourceful state, and, falling back on some resiliency skills, whether it's taking a deep breath, going for a walk, managing through and noticing your own self-talk. Like, what am I telling myself is true about this and what's actually true? And so getting yourself back to, we call it being at my best, getting yourself back to a place where you're really not operating from a dysregulated or a less resourceful place is super important, because it prevents you from saying and doing things that actually could inflame a situation versus resolve them. And then the second thing is start with curiosity versus judgment, right? So if someone or a group has behaved in a way inconsistent with what the decision of the team was, you start with what happened, what was going on. I made a ton of mistakes in my career where that would happen, and I'd go in guns a-blazing of like, we said to do this, you did this, you're bad, I'm good, what's going on here? What I learned is starting with, wow, this isn't what we expected. Can you share with me a little bit of what happened? And often as you do that, you realize that the story I had made up in my head around bad intentions wasn't true. There are other things that were going on, and maybe things that people didn't find the way to communicate at the time the decision was made. But by really understanding, and you know what, sometimes there are bad intentions, 100%, but more often than not, there aren't. By starting with curiosity and understanding, what we end up with is therefore more data that helps us make a better decision. And we set up an expectation in that relationship or in that team that when people don't follow through, there will be consequences. We will have the conversation conversation to say what went on. You're creating the accountability mechanism, which I think is the most important thing. It's when people don't follow through and you don't engage in a discussion or a consequence-driven situation, they'll do it again because it's then deemed to be acceptable behavior versus, we said this, something else happened, what went on? What do we do now? How do we rectify it? What's your role in rectifying it? Sets a different expectation.
So well said. My behavior makes it personal. And then it becomes personal to them where it almost always is never personal. But I've made it personal and I probably offended them. And then they get personal and then they react. Is if you don't do that and you share what you recommend, which is tremendous, then to say, if it was going to happen again, what would happen so that we could avoid it? And typically it's better communication. There is that mutuality. There is that partnership of I'll let you know it's not going to work and then we can talk about it versus I just won't do it. Leading from that, what happens when the decision wasn't the best, it's not getting the outcome that you're looking for. And there's a myriad of different reactions. One is to bury it. Two is just to ignore it. But the high road that a lot of leaders do well is to call it. Could you share some tips on how to do that and to call it, rectify and move forward?
You call it early and you call it simply would be my biggest tip. Even if you're not sure it's not working out, you highlight to folks like, we're not sure what's going on here, but this may be an issue. It's helping people be prepared for something that may need to change. As humans, we often react poorly to surprise. And we're much better at like, oh, we may need to be aware of this versus it's blowing up. I think we believe when we admit a mistake, it erodes trust, right? Because now my boss, the management is like, oh, Stephanie's making bad decisions. And I think what actually happens is when we say, I got it wrong, people go, wow, I can trust her to be transparent. I can trust her to be accountable. And actually, it increases the level of confidence and trust leadership has in you. And that it's scary to admit we're wrong because we get this identity like I am as good as my decisions versus I am as good as my ability to evaluate my decisions and make adjustments.
I think it's such a huge learning. The leader that puts his hand up and says, that was me, they're highly respected, they're highly trusted. And then again, saying, this is what went wrong. So you're doing the diagnostic as well. This is how we're going to rectify it so it doesn't happen again. It says, hey, this is someone of quality and stature. Are there any watchouts in terms of taking decisions or even setting them up to be agreed to and be implemented?
We've talked about a few of them, but I'll just kind of highlight. One is it's a huge watch out if you notice you or your team members are avoiding the hard conversation. We all know what the hard conversations are. And when you see a pattern in yourself or others that we're actively avoiding it, that's a big red flag. And the action is you name it and then you figure out how to find the courage to deal with it. The other one I mentioned is in big transformations, a watch out is when we assume the more junior folks will figure out the details because they will, but they won't do it the same way. And they don't understand what you're trying to achieve in a way that can ensure they make the choices that increases the likelihood of success of the overall change. They're smart people. They can make great choices, but often they're not empowered or entrusted with all of the details that help them kind of line up on that. And then the third thing I would say, and this is one I wish I knew 25 years ago, is implementation is way more important. Execution, implementation is way more important than the design, and it's way harder. As we think about change journeys and finding a way that we don't allow ourselves to think we're done when we have the org design done, or we're not done when the business processes are done. We are done 3 years later when it's implemented. Building the muscle and awareness in yourself and in organizations that implementation will be harder. And that's normal and appropriate. And we need to resource ourselves in terms of capacity and capability and resource our teams that it's not like a throw it over the fence, go execute, which I still see so many organizations doing so often.
So true. And yes, exactly that we're done and the team goes away and it's not being implemented. And in the spirit of change on the run, we talked about how fast-paced we are these days. And it's an interesting inflection, I think, for you because you have led huge organizations globally. You're helping leaders and leadership teams to do so now. What is the one thing that you would do that would give you that 80% results in 20% of the time just because of time pressure and the expediency required?
I'm actually going to give you two, Phil.
I love it. You're overachieving again.
No, the first is, when time is tight and choice is needed, spend 50% or 80% of your time clarifying what you're trying to decide on. Spend the time clarifying the question, because once you know that, often the choices are clearer and the ability to get alignment is much easier. The second I would say is set up an objective way to evaluate the possibilities, whether it's an Excel spreadsheet with criteria on one side and choices on the other. When we need to move fast, we can get overwhelmed by our emotion and our intuition. And it's harder to move fast when we're dealing without facts, because facts have a way of diffusing emotional arguments that get in the way of choice. So we go back to, it's not to say we only use facts, especially when we're fast paced, but we have enough facts that they enable a choice and that they enable a criteria we can go back to evaluate. So get clear on the question and then get clear on a few objective facts to help you evaluate your choice, and then hold those together as you go through the process as a team. It's not perfect, but it's supportive and it lets you feel like you're not just on quicksand all the time.
Excellent advice. And thanks so much for taking the time to be on the podcast today. How can people get in contact with you?
First of all, thanks so much for having me today, Phil. It's been just a huge pleasure. People can connect with me at my email address, which is stephanie.wilkes, WILKES, at bridge-partnership.com.
Perfect. Thanks so much. And we'll put that in the show notes. Thanks again for being on. This has been a great conversation. And to the listeners, thank you for being a part of it too. And I hope that there's something that Stephanie shared that you could put into action immediately. And until the next time, I wish you all the best as you continue to lead change.